What would you do if one day, your homeowners association decided that your front door was the wrong shade of blue and fined you for it? Or if they rewrote the rules overnight to make something you did perfectly legal yesterday a punishable offense today? That was life in Pleasant Pines, a picture-perfect suburban neighborhood where the grass was always trimmed, the mailboxes were exactly 42 inches tall, and the self-appointed Queen of Order, Karen Wilkerson, ruled with an iron clipboard. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday in May, the kind of day where the sun hit just right, and the smell of freshly cut grass lingered in the air. I had just finished mowing my lawn, exactly 3 inches tall, per HOA regulations, when I decided it was time to replace my old American flag. It had served proudly for 5 years, braving summer storms and winter winds, but now it was faded and frayed. As a veteran, I believed in treating Old Glory with the respect it deserved, so I carefully removed it, folded it into a precise triangle, and placed a brand new flag on the pole. For a moment, I just stood there, watching the fabric catch the wind, feeling that familiar sense of pride swell in my chest. Then I heard the voice. "Excuse me. Excuse me. What do you think you're doing?" I turned, already bracing myself. There she was, Karen Wilkerson, Pleasant Pines HOA president and the single most infuriating person I had ever met. Her highlighted blonde bob bounced as she stormed across my freshly mowed lawn, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a medieval shield. She was dressed in her usual uniform of HOA authority, white capri pants, a nautical striped top, and oversized sunglasses that hid her eyes but not her disapproval. I kept my voice even. "Good afternoon, Karen." Her lips pressed into a thin line as her gaze darted to my newly raised flag. "That's a violation," she snapped. "You didn't submit a flag replacement form." I stared at her, waiting for her to say she was joking. She wasn't. "Karen, there's no flag replacement form in the HOA handbook." She adjusted her sunglasses, tilting her chin up. "There is now. I wrote it myself last month." That's when I knew this wasn't just a citation. This was personal. I took a slow breath, counting to 5 like I had learned in the military to keep my temper in check. Karen thrived on confrontation, and I refused to give her the satisfaction of an argument. Instead, I crossed my arms and held my ground. The flag is the same size as the last one. And more importantly, the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act prevents HOAs from restricting homeowners from flying it. You can't just make up rules because you don't like something, Karen. Her face flushed a shade of red that nearly matched the stripes on my flag. "Don't you dare quote laws to me," she hissed, jabbing a manicured finger toward my house. "I've been president of this association for 7 years. I know the rules, because I write them." With that, she pivoted on her overpriced sandals and stalked away, furiously tapping on her phone. I had no doubt that she was already mobilizing her minions, crafting emails, and plotting her next move. By the time I checked my inbox that evening, the violation notice was waiting for me. It included a digitally inserted ruler claiming my new flag was at least 20% larger than the old one, despite it being the exact same size. Attached was a newly created flag replacement application, a 4-page document demanding everything from the flag's manufacturer to proof of its American-made certification. At the bottom was a ridiculous clause: the Architectural Review Committee would not consider my application for at least 30 days. Until then, I was ordered to remove the flag. I stared at the email, equal parts furious and amused. Karen was escalating, and she expected me to roll over like I had in the past. But this wasn't about an overly bright porch light or a bird feeder that disrupted community aesthetics. This was my right as an American. I printed the email, highlighted every absurd section, and pinned it to my refrigerator as a reminder of what I was dealing with. Then I did something Karen wasn't expecting. I did my research. The next morning, I left early for work, avoiding a potential front yard showdown. As a structural engineer, I had deadlines to meet, and I wasn't about to waste my time playing bureaucratic games. But when I pulled back into my driveway that evening, something felt off. At first, I couldn't place it. Then, my stomach dropped. My flag was gone. The pole stood empty, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. I felt a cold wave of anger settle on my chest. No way. No way she did this. I stormed up to my front door and pulled up my security camera footage. My jaw clenched as I watched the video feed. There, at 2:15 p.m., Karen Wilkerson herself walked right up to my flagpole, reached up, and yanked my flag down. She folded it sloppily, tucked it under her arm, and marched away like she was taking out the trash. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't an HOA citation. This wasn't a fine. This was theft. I took a deep breath, my hands tightening into fists. This time, she had gone too far. Instead of storming over to her house, which is exactly what she wanted, I called the police. 20 minutes later, Officer Daniel Parker stood in my living room, watching the footage with a deepening frown. He was a young but experienced officer, probably in his early 30s, with a no-nonsense demeanor that softened slightly when he learned about my military background. "This isn't just a neighborhood dispute," he said, shaking his head. "This is theft. And we take that seriously." I let out a breath, relieved. "What happens now?" "We'll talk to her," Parker assured me. "If she still has the flag, we'll recover it. If not, we'll move forward accordingly." As Parker left to confront the queen of the HOA, a small part of me wondered if I had just poked a hornet's nest. But I reminded myself of one simple fact. I wasn't the one who had stolen someone else's property. I didn't sleep well that night. Even though I had done the right thing by involving the police, I knew Karen wouldn't take this lying down. She thrived on control, and for the first time, someone was pushing back in a way she couldn't ignore. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the security footage over and over in my head. The next morning, I worked from home, waiting for an update. At 9:30 a.m., my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Officer Parker standing on my porch, his usual firm demeanor cracked with unease. "We spoke with Mrs. Wilkerson last night," he said, shifting his weight. "She admitted to taking your flag." My stomach tightened. I didn't like the hesitation in his voice. "And?" He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "She burned it." For a few seconds, my brain refused to process what I had just heard. I had seen men and women risk their lives for that flag. I had lost friends who had come home under it. And Karen, a suburban dictator with a clipboard, had the audacity to take my property and destroy it. She what? I finally managed. Parker's expression hardened. "She claims it was proper disposal since your flag was an unauthorized installation." I clenched my jaw so tight my teeth ached. "I want to press charges." Parker nodded. "That's your right." I thought that would be the end of it. That justice would take its course. I underestimated just how deep Karen's web of influence went. By noon, a new neighborhood petition had been posted on the community bulletin board. In bold letters, it read, "Petition to remove Jim Callahan for disrupting community unity and property values." I stared at the list of signatures below it, rage twisting in my gut. Some names were the usual suspects, Karen's loyal HOA board members, but others stung. People I'd waved to in the mornings. Neighbors I'd helped shovel driveways for in the winter. And then there was the worst part. At 1 p.m., Officer Parker called me again, his voice tight. "Jim, we have a problem." I gripped the phone. "What now?" "Karen's trying to flip the story. She's claiming she saw you burning the flag last night in a fit of rage. And she has a witness." I almost dropped the phone. "What?" "One of her HOA board members is backing her up." They're saying they saw you set fire to the flag. I felt my pulse hammer in my ears. This wasn't just petty HOA nonsense anymore. This was a blatant, calculated attempt to frame me. Parker hesitated. I know she's lying. But I need you to give me something solid, Jim. Do you have proof you were home all night? I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. Karen had taken my flag, destroyed it, and now she was trying to turn me into the villain. But she didn't know one thing. I had cameras. Without a word, I went to my laptop and pulled up the footage. Time-stamped and clear as day, it showed me inside my house the entire night. I emailed it to Parker within minutes. An hour later, I got a text. Parker, got the footage. She's done. But I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to back down easily. The sun was setting when I saw Karen standing in the middle of the street, watching as a police cruiser pulled up to her house. She had her arms crossed, her posture stiff, but there was something else in her stance now, a flicker of uncertainty. It was the first crack in her carefully controlled facade. I stayed on my porch as Officer Parker and another officer approached her door. She greeted them with her usual manufactured politeness, her voice carrying across the cul-de-sac. Officers, this is all a misunderstanding. I was merely enforcing HOA regulations, as is my duty. Parker wasn't playing games. Mrs. Wilkerson, you're aware that we have surveillance footage proving you stole and destroyed Mr. Callahan's flag, correct? Karen tilted her head, her lips curling in feigned confusion. I took an unregistered flag down, yes. But I followed proper disposal procedures. It was my responsibility as HOA president to uphold our community standards. Parker exchanged a look with his partner. You burned private property that didn't belong to you. That's theft and destruction of property. And given the nature of the item, there are additional laws that come into play here. Karen's smile froze. For the first time, she looked rattled. But in true Karen fashion, she doubled down. Oh, come on. This is ridiculous. Jim's always had a problem following the rules. I mean, have you seen how he trims his hedges? She let out a forced laugh, as if this was all some amusing little mix-up. And then, in a move that made my blood boil, she threw out one last desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative. Did you even check the fire pit? How do you know it wasn't Jim who burned it? Officer Parker stared at her, unimpressed. Because we have video footage of him inside his house all night. The moment the words left his mouth, Karen's face paled. The weight of reality was finally starting to sink in. I could see the wheels in her head turning, searching for an escape. And that's when she did the thing that turned the entire neighborhood against her in an instant. She started name-dropping. You do realize who my husband is, don't you? She scoffed, her voice taking on that sharp, entitled edge. He plays golf with the mayor. He's good friends with your police chief. If you think for 1 second that some petty HOA dispute is going to result in actual charges, you're mistaken. The sheer arrogance of it made my stomach turn. Parker, to his credit, didn't even blink. Ma'am, you're under investigation. And name-dropping city officials won't change the law. Karen's confidence wavered. But before she could recover, something happened that she hadn't anticipated. The HOA board turned against her. The vice president of the HOA, a middle-aged man named Greg Mitchell, had been standing on the sidewalk, watching everything unfold. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. For the record, Karen, he said loudly, making sure the entire neighborhood could hear, the board never approved any of this. Karen's head snapped toward him. Greg, what the hell are you talking about? Greg folded his arms. You abused your position. You didn't consult the board when you created that flag replacement rule. You held private meetings. And now you've made a mess that we all have to deal with. The board is officially voting to remove you as HOA president, Karen reeled back like she'd been slapped. "You can't do that," she shrieked. Greg didn't even flinch. "Actually, we can. And we just did." The entire neighborhood had gathered by now. Some of them stood in their doorways, others had stepped out onto their lawns, watching in stunned silence as the queen of the HOA was stripped of her power in real time. I saw Mrs. Reynolds, the woman who had fought Karen over her rose garden, smirk. Mr. Carter, who had been fined for his son's basketball hoop, let out a low whistle. Even Mr. Anderson, who had endured Karen's obnoxious rule for years, folded his arms in satisfaction. And Karen knew it. Her empire was crumbling. But it wasn't over yet. Because Officer Parker wasn't done. "Mrs. Wilkerson, I need you to come with us to the station to give a formal statement regarding the theft and destruction of property." Karen's eyes widened. "Wait. A statement? Am I being charged?" "For now, we need your statement. But given the evidence, the district attorney will be reviewing the case for potential charges related to flag desecration as well." For the first time since I'd known her, Karen was speechless. Karen stood frozen, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides as the weight of the moment settled on her shoulders. For years, she had ruled over Pleasant Pines with unchecked authority, handing out citations like candy, dictating the smallest details of people's lives, where they could park, what color they could paint their fences, even how fragrant their gardens were allowed to be. But now, in front of the very people she had tormented, she wasn't the one handing down consequences. She was the one facing them. Officer Parker gestured toward his patrol car. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." Karen's voice, normally sharp and commanding, came out in a near whisper. "You can't be serious." Greg Mitchell, still standing nearby with the rest of the HOA board, crossed his arms and exhaled through his nose. "Karen, just go." She turned toward him, her face contorted with disbelief. "Greg, you know me. I've spent years keeping this neighborhood in order. Without me, this place will fall apart. The property values." Greg cut her off with a shake of his head. "No, Karen. We'll be just fine." And that was it. The moment Karen Wilkerson realized she had no more allies, no more power, no more control. The rules she had hidden behind for years, the endless regulations, the selectively enforced citations, the ridiculous fines, none of it mattered now. The law had finally caught up to her. As the officers gently guided her toward the squad car, the neighborhood watched in stunned silence. Some exchanged glances, others murmured to one another, and a few, Mrs. Reynolds, Mr. Anderson, even the normally quiet Carters, allowed small, satisfied smiles to cross their faces. Mr. Thompson, whose trash can Karen had photographed just a day ago for being visible from the street, gave me a subtle thumbs up. Mrs. Carter actually clapped, just once, before catching herself and clearing her throat. Karen turned back one last time, eyes wide, searching the crowd for someone, anyone, to speak up for her. But no one did. The moment the patrol car door closed, a strange feeling settled over Pleasant Pines. It wasn't joy, exactly. It wasn't celebration. It was relief. For the first time in years, people wouldn't have to fear an email from the HOA. They wouldn't have to worry about petty fines or surprise citations or being humiliated at community meetings over the shade of their shutters. They were free. As the car pulled away, I exhaled slowly, watching it disappear around the corner. Maybe, just maybe, Pleasant Pines could finally live up to its name. But the real question is, what happens now? With Karen gone, would the HOA learn from this, or would another tyrant rise to take her place? And more importantly, how many other neighborhoods are still living under the rule of an unchecked HOA dictator? Have you ever had to deal with an HOA, or a Karen, abusing their power? Share your story below, let's see who had it worse.